1, where we are going to revisit the last few speakers and have a discussion in a panel. So the facilitator of this panel is Bob Shepherd. He is, of course, joined by Fran Lyons from Dalrymple Landcare, Dr. Susan Orgill and Dr. Robyn Cowley. Please make them welcome and have all your questions in that live Q&A section. Bob, to read.
Hey, thanks very much. We've had a great session there, despite a hiccup, but it was interesting this morning that the Roseanne Journal said we need more publication or more submissions to the journal, and I think that's exactly what we'll get from these 3 papers. They've got a lot of technical information, a lot of applied information. They've been some similarities. So we'll move straight into questions, and our first questions are, where are we? Just waiting for them to come up. We'll start at the top. Watch, great presentation, Fran. When producers argue they can't lock up that much land per year, how do you respond? Over to you, Fran.
Yeah, good question, Dione. I guess we never think about it as locking up land. It's just a different spatial distribution of the same number of cattle that we've always run. It was just taking a bite from each end. I like to say dividing paddocks up with permanent fencing and mobbing cattle together so that we could, run the same amount of cattle in lesser and move them around the property. So, I mean, when I say all of the property gets a wet season graze, we also aim to give everything a wet season graze where we can as well too. So it's not really locking up that country and not using it. It's just a different spatial organisation of the same number of mouths.
And just continuing on, Fran, how long are your rest graze periods? Just from Bruce Alchin.
Yeah. In the wet season, we aim to we end up every probably 2 to 3 weeks. Depends on the class of cattle as well. So obviously younger cattle and dry cattle, it's easier to move. With cows having calves, we're not so keen to move them. But we try and move them through paddocks right next to each other. So it's a matter of opening a gate and, and the cows take their calves through. So in the wet season, we're looking for a 30-day rest period. That's what we're aiming for. Really aiming to get to a 90-day rest period. At the moment, we're probably between a 60-day rest period, just working towards that longer rest in the dry.
Andrew Craig on the forage budgeting side, Fran, how do you pick the sites where you actually go out and say, well, I'm going to base my forage budget on this site? How do you select those sites?
Yeah, another good question. It's really not the same site. We often jump on a motorbike and just ride through the paddock. And I suppose to be really specific about that, at the start, we did stop and measure out how many square metres and really estimate that. But when you get to be doing that for a number of years and you get that feedback of going back to check and you get more confidence in your pasture budgeting, you really anymore. It is really a matter of just riding through the pasture on your bike and looking down into the pasture as opposed to out the window of the car, and you just get a feel for this is 25 stock days per hectare. On the black soil it might be 12 stock days per hectare. Over on a red soil ridge it might be 45 stock days per hectare, and you sort of average that for the paddock. So it's not the same sites every year, and it's not really specific. It's just a general feel after a while of, with lots of feedback and practice that you get to do pasture budgeting.
All right, thanks, Fran. Question from Matt to Robyn. Can you give background to the difference between grassland and woodland in terms of pasture type? And he thinks he might have missed some of the technical stuff. I think we all did for a little while there.
Yeah, so the grassland is a ribbon bluegrass, I think they've got that over in WA. And the woody species are rosewood and bohemian. Others, but they're the main ones, very resilient to fire. So fire doesn't really kill them, it just keeps them small. And then on the red soil, that was a eucalypt woodland, so inland bloodwood. There's hakeas and it's dominated by black spear. It used to be an arid shortgrass, but with high rainfall, we've now got black spear. Yeah, so that's them.
Righto.
Yeah.
Down. Another question to Robyn. Robyn, in the grass model, the tree area is affecting pasture growth simulation a lot.
Yep.
From, where are we? From the results you showed, there might be a need to recalibrate the tree area impacts at least for the woodlands. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it has something I've been looking at for a while. Been working with John, even with the tree grass sites that we had, the tree relationship seemed to be a lot less steep than as observed in Queensland. And so I have adjusted parameters in the model just generally for what we're using in Northern NT. But yeah, a lot more work to be done there.
Also to Robyn, ask what is the grazing management of the trial, please?
Yeah, really good question. So initially, the grazing plots, which are the 5 plots, which are about 2.5 hectares each, were open to grazing, but they used to burn other parts of the paddock as well, so the cattle didn't completely hammer the burnt plots. But even early burnt plots, the cattle would be grazing any green leaf that rose. It was a lot longer until it rained than the late burnt plots. And the early burnt plots were starting to decline in condition through time. So in 2013, we put up fences around the outside of them so that we can spell those plots after the October burns until the end of the following wet season. So they get a wet season spell after they're burnt, so every 2 years now.
Righto. From Peter O'Regan to Susan. Susan, why is the course...
Organic matter.
Oh, sorry, organic matter discarded by the labs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, by definition, soil organic matter is everything that's less than 2 millimeters in length. And the reason they do that is to standardize that analysis across all labs. And it's the less than 2 millimeter fraction that's highly correlated with the soil properties, which organic carbon influences. But we know that to get increases in soil organic carbon, we need organic matter supply to the soil. And the pathway for that is through root exudates, which is very small and labile fractions, but also through leaves, litter, manure, and plant roots. And so that can be a sensitive measure in dry environments such as the rangelands. And that's why we've been looking at that coarse organic matter fraction and found it to be a sensitive indicator to management change.
And while we got you there, Susan, from Angie Eastbergs, how were the rehydration planning and works actually funded?
Oh, that's a good question. Part of it was funded through Western Local Land Service, but Luke has also, the Mashfords have also done a lot of this work off their own back and bought a lot of the gear. But it's been done in close collaboration with Western LLS and Hugh Pringle at EMU.
And continuing on from Adrian Hall, thank you for your presentation. Did you monitor control sites? If so, what was the comparison in results?
Another good question. So, man, had 4 minutes to jam my soil data part in there. We do have control sites across good condition Mitchell grasslands and also Mitchell grasslands which are in poorer condition across Catalpa Station. And it fell into sync. So just first of all, it was a point in time comparison. So this is an ongoing project where we're looking at changes through time to capture that temporal impact, but also using satellite imagery to look at changes in cover. But the poorer grassland, the poorer condition degraded grassland certainly had a lower level of soil organic carbon and fine fraction organic matter compared to grasslands with well-functioning gill guys throughout Catalpa.
Thank you. And to Robyn from John McLaughlin. Robyn, was one of your takeaway points that burning country with poor pastures, that is annuals versus 3Ps, won't achieve the desired results in terms of woody growth?
Yeah, that's a good point. So it won't get a good burn, so you don't get an effective burn for managing woody cover because your fuel loads don't tend to be adequate, but also it's not good for your pastures either. So the annuals don't tend to come back that well. Sometimes you can end up with really bare pastures, and that's not only, we haven't only observed that on the fire experiment, but elsewhere when we've burnt patches on Kidman, they've found that as well.
Back to Susan. We often think of continual rainfall events over the wet seasons, but often we have a month or more of just hot, dry conditions where pastures struggle. How is this managed in a spelling program? I'm not too sure.
I'm not sure if that's...
Might be for Fran.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's for me. Maybe Fran?
Yeah, and that's definitely a good question. I guess we have a grazing plan. We always have a grazing plan of where animals are going to be, moved to next and so on and so forth. And the only thing we really change about that is whether the grass is actively growing and we've had rain, or whether it's not actively growing and we haven't had rain. So we go about that plan almost, regardless of what the rainfall is. We just look at the pasture as to whether we're moving the cattle or not. So, if we do have some dry periods punctuating the wet season, the cattle are moved in accordance to how that pasture looks. So, when I say the property is wet season spelled, it's grazed as well in that time, but, the grazing period might only be short 1 or 2 weeks out of a 3 or 4 month wet season. So it's not an entire spell. We need, when I explain that sort of phase 2, grazing that phase 2 grass, we really plan, that's a good stimulation for the perennial plants, and we really aim to get that stimulation in there too. So the cattle are being moved across the country. It's just that for the majority of the wet season, it's being let to rest.
Thanks, Fran. Question from Ed Wood to Robyn about the timing of the late burn. Is it after the first rain event?
No. So it's in October, and it's rare that there would have been any rain before then. So they tend to be very hot, dry fires.
A question to Susan from Terry Butel. Susan, any economic results on the emu work?
Oh, I wish I could give you that information, but I don't have it at hand. But if you follow up with me, we can chat with Hugh and the mash feds about their return on investment and their kind of business performance after putting in place some of these activities. It's a really good question, though. Got to pay.
Yeah, no, it's something that we'll need to follow up on. That'll be great.
Absolutely.
From Raymond Stacey, also to you, Susan, what graze management overlays the mechanical work? So what grazing management overlays the mechanical work?
Yeah. So after the banks are put in place, there's a period of resting just to get the banks to settle in. So after some rainfall events and quite significant rainfall, the banks have settled, and then we can bring animals in for grazing. So across all of Catalpa Station, around parts of the perimeter, there's TGP fencing, and Catalpa is rotationally grazed to make sure that we've got rest periods for rejuvenation of palatable species and resting paddocks.
Thanks very much, Susan. We've had a great series of questions. It's probably one of the most vigorous Q&A sessions we've had in the conference, and I think it's a reflection of the high quality of those 3 presentations. So thanks very much to Susan, Fran and Robyn.